This morning we've got Eric Pinkerton from Hivint, a TrustWave company, now an Optus company as well, moved from Singtel. He's suffering a bit of an identity crisis, but many of you have probably already seen and know Eric from cutting up the rug at many conferences around the country. So if everyone could please welcome Eric.
Thanks, Valdemar. Can you hear me? Tough. Okay. So when I submitted this paper, in truth, I didn't really fully know what this talk was going to be and where it was going to go. So it's been an interesting journey, and it's been a very different one for me. So hopefully you enjoy the ride. But let's dive in. So the first thing I noticed when I went to conferences and started seeing presentations about risk is that for some reason all risk people are obsessed with aircraft and planes, and they talk about planes and plane crashes and black box recorders. I never really figured out quite what that is, but I think it leads to a style of thinking about risk that is essentially that your business is an airplane and risk is a mountain, and you need to steer around the mountain or over the mountain, and that's how we avoid the risks. And I think that it's kind of not quite right. What I want to talk about today is risk appetite, but before I do that, I'm going to give you a little bit of a primer on risk, and I'll flick through it pretty quickly because I'm assuming that everyone has a reasonable understanding of it. Anyone recognize that mountain, by the way? That's Toblerone Mountain. Toblerone Mountain. Just kidding. So I tend to think about risk a bit like this. So your business is a ship, and the ocean is risk. And maybe you're a pirate, maybe you've got one eye because pirates have a particularly high risk appetite. And risk people are coming to you saying, well, in order to remove the risk, we need to take the boat out of the ocean and put it on high ground. And you're kind of, hang on a minute, if I take my boat out of the ocean and put it on high ground, now what I've got is a sloping warehouse with crappy access. Your business needs to be enveloped by risk in order to do what it does. And managing the risk isn't about just removing it. It's about, thinking about life jackets and training and the journey and the type of journeys you're going to make and the type of vessel you have and whether it's fit for purpose on the type of journey you're going to make. The rubber meets the road for risk in my favorite thing, which is the 5x5 risk matrix. If you're greedy, you might have a 7x7 or a 6x6, but for most people, a 5x5 risk matrix is where it all happens. Of note, down in the bottom, we have the Black Swan event, which is the conceptual 9/11 or the Pearl Harbor. This is what we have insurance for, this little part down here. But essentially, this is what most people's risk registers look like, and this is a tool to separate and prioritize the things that we find. And the way it works is essentially we come up with a list of all the bad things that happen. We sort them by order with the critical stuff at the top. Number one is, a butterfly flaps its wings in Brazil, and a year later all our customers' data appears on Pastebin. We go down the list. We acknowledge that there's a couple of things or a few things that the unknown unknowns. We have no ideas what they are, so we don't really do much with those. We then set out to treat them. And the way we treat them is we avoid it, we reduce it, we transfer it, we accept it, or we put it in a risk register, put our fingers in our ears and shout, la, 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 la. Then what kind of happens, now we've got our risk, is they go over into the context of the organizational risk. Don't forget, I'm talking about cyber risk here and cyber risk appetite. So they go into the organizational risk, of which there are many, many more. And you'll see that now my cyber risk number one, the butterfly in the Amazon, is now number 9 on the list. And in most organizations, whether it's admitted or not, there's this conceptual dotted line that is the difference between the stuff you do and the stuff you don't do, or you put it in the risk register, to put it another way. And this is kind of how I think about risk. Risk isn't about finding and fixing all the issues that are facing your organization. It's about acknowledging that you don't have the time, the money, the resources to fix all the problems, and then creating a defensible position and justification, not just for the things you do, but some justification for the things you decide not to do. And this is what surprises a lot of people in cyber risk, that they come up with a list of things, they take it to the business decides to do nothing about it, and they think it's because the organization doesn't understand risk, but more often than not, it's because the cyber people don't understand the organization and don't understand that those risks in the context of the other things the business is wrangling don't really make the list of things to do. So let's talk about risk appetite. So as a consultant, I often find myself asking the question, what is your cyber risk appetite? What's your appetite for cyber risk? And if I'm really honest to myself, one of the reasons I do this is basically for shiggles. It's kind of like I'm Columbo and I already know the answer and they don't know the answer. And they always say the same thing. They always say, oh, we have a really low appetite for risk. We have a low appetite for cyber risk. And I'm kind of like, mate, I've seen your pen test reports for the last 3 years. If your risk appetite was a sport, it would be like naked base jumping. So here we are, that we band around this concept of risk appetite, and there seems to be a very frequently disparity in the risk appetite that organizations think they have, and don't forget, I'm talking about cyber, and what it actually looks like in truth, or what I see through my jaded glasses, or my embittered view. So here we are, what I set out to do with this organization is talk about what is risk appetite, what is my risk appetite as an organization. Okay, wow, what should it be? And ouch, how can I change it? How can I modify it? So if you've seen me talk before, you'll know that I'm a big fan of analogies. I like to come up with a nice, easy to understand analogy, take it out of into that space, play with it, and then drop it back in. My colleague in Perth likes to call this knowledge scaffold, kind of ironically. So I think that a nice analogy for risk appetite, in order to understand it, is the concept of shrinkage in retail. So we all know about shrinkage. Essentially, if you're a shopkeeper, the stock you purchased, the stock minus the stock you've sold, minus the stock that you've spoiled, and minus the stock you still have is shrinkage. So, if we imagine I'm a shopkeeper and I have 100, crack pipes, and I sell 90 of them, and I drop one of them on the floor, and now there's 8 left on the shelf, and I'm like, hang on a minute, one of them's gone missing, right? So that's my shrinkage. I've got 1% shrinkage. Most retailers lose about 1.8% of their stock. Fashion retailers, it goes up to 2.43%. So now at 1% of loss, I'm actually stoked, especially when you consider that most of my customers are crack addicts, right? So the next thing is you look at self-service checkouts. Now, when self-service checkouts became a thing, I'm guessing that like me, most of the people in this room had a little bit of a brain orgasm, and they were kind of like, wow, I could just walk out with stuff. And shrinkage in self-service checkouts goes up to about 4% from 1.8%. And retailers call this sweethearting, which comes from the practice of checkout operators pretending to swipe things for their loved ones and their family and their sweethearts. It's the same, but now you're sort of self-serving because you're loving yourself, and you're the one who's weighing batteries and saying it's carrots and walking out. So we know that the shrinkage goes up, but the interesting thing is, retailers are less concerned about that because of the gains that they've made by not having to employ as many checkout operators. Never going to have self-service in my crack pipe emporium, by the way. So what's happening? Obviously, no store wants to lose, 2% of its stock to Winona Ryder, but retailers tolerate it as a cost of doing business, providing that it's consistent, so it's predictable, and it's a manageable number. It's more or less what everyone else in your sector is putting up with. Now, you have several levers that you can influence that percentage with as a store manager. You've got CCTV, you've got store detectives, you've got alarm systems and with die packs, security guards. In the UK, we have the most effective measure of all for shoplifters is cardboard policemen, bizarrely. The other interesting thing is it's completely possible for storekeepers to cut shrinkage completely out. So if you think about 24-hour garage, shrinkage goes through the roof because most of the customers, or a large percentage of the customers, are under the influence of something. So they install one of these drawers. And of course, when the drawer is in operation at 4 a.m., shrinkage is effectively zero. But the trade-off to that is that sales also drop round. And I know this because I'm a very romantic person and I sometimes like to buy flowers for my wife, but I'm far less likely to buy flowers for my wife at 4 a.m. from the 24-hour garage if the attendant's going to shove them through the drawer, because my wife's probably already mad at me and it's not going to help if I give her some flowers that have been through the drawer. So if you think about those concepts and then we try to bring them into the realm of cyber, it's kind of difficult to define an acceptable loss in cyber. So I had a thought, what is the equivalent of shrinkage in cyber? For denial of service attacks or I'm offline for a day, that might be easy to quantify depending on the type of business they're in, but we don't have a relative equivalent. So here's what I came up with. So I won't read them all out, but you get the idea. It was the worst Christmas ever. The metrics that we have for measuring loss are not consistent across different organizations. They're very hard to measure in a meaningful way. And by contrast, the levers we have for adjusting those things are endless. So firewalls, IDS, SIEM, rosary beads, you name it. So what do? So the risk people in the room will obviously know if they've been to any trading that it boils down to money and the financial cost of a breach. And all you need to do is calculate the cost of a breach to you and then use that to inform your risk appetite. How much money am I willing to learn? And to this, we had some help from, we've had various companies do this. IBM did one last year where they worked out on average the cost of a breach for each record lost was $148. So you go, well, $148 a pop, how many of those am I willing to lose? But the problem is that's, to me, we look at the costs from in different countries and how this worked out. And to me, these, because they're averages and they're statistics and they are aggregated across all sorts of different organizations, they're completely meaningless. And it's incredibly difficult to calculate the cost of a breach you haven't had, when, if we're honest, it's almost impossible to calculate the cost of the breaches we have had. And also a breach that you haven't had is a hell of a lot cheaper than one that you have had, because what you're doing when you have had a breach is spending a fortune in quick succession to mitigate risks. If you've got Mandiant running around patching things in a weekend that you could have done or should have done over 12 months, it's going to cost you a lot more, and it's not a useful number. Watching people trying to work out this stuff, to me, reminds me of the time I went to buy a bed, and I walked into the bed shop, and the guy in the shop's kind of, okay, how much do you want to spend on a bed? And I was kind of like, I'd never bought a bed. Not that I'd been sleeping on cardboard or anything, but I think my parents had bought beds or something. So the conversation went, like this: how much do you want to spend on a bed? I don't know. How much do people spend on beds? Oh, it's a difficult question. How long's a piece of string? How much did you spend on your car? Well, I don't know, about 40K. Okay, well, how long do you spend in your car? Maybe an hour a day. Okay, well, how long do you spend in your bed? Maybe 8 hours a day. Tap, 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 tap. You might want to lie down, sir. So it's nigh on impossible to work this stuff out. So the other thing is something that I talked about last year, which was around reputational damage and how you calculate the cost to a business in reputational damage. And the reality is it's nigh on impossible. So some people believe that the great white hope for this and putting numbers on this thing is the insurance industry, because that's what they do. They collect heaps and heaps of empirical data. They get their actuaries and they Monte Carlo the bejesus out of it. And for the reason they know that your car is less likely to be damaged when you go and insure your car if you work in cybersecurity than when you work in nightclub security. They know they're going to know what a breach costs, right? They have, the problem is that they have decades of information and detailed police reports with which to base the calculations about car theft and car damage on, but they don't have that data about cybersecurity. And more often than not, what they're insuring people for and what they're paying out isn't the cost of the breach so much as the cost of cleaning up after the breach, which is quite a different proposition. I struggle to see how anyone is going to compile meaningful information about this stuff to the point where it's my view that qualitative risk assessment is like this. It's finger in the wind as. And people say, well, the answer is quantitative risk assessment, where you take lots of that information. And this is what I think is happening here, is that there are people out there who are talking about quantitative risk assessment and analysis of these numbers and Monte Carlo of these numbers. But as an old school IT guy, I know that garbage in, garbage out, up until the point where you've got so much information you can start getting some meaningful things. But I don't think anyone's got that quality of data and it's meaningful. So I tend to think that people who are talking about coming up with meaningful numbers from the data set we've got are either naive or they're being dishonest. The other thing about insurance is, so the fundamental tenet of insurance, or one of the fundamental tenets, is the made whole doctrine. So essentially what that means is if I know someone steals a crack pipe, my insurance provider should pay out for the cost of my crack pipe if I'm insured, unless they can weasel out of it somehow, because it turns out that apparently it's an offence to sell, supply, display a sale of bong or ice pipes or the component parts of a bong or pipe, whether the bong or pipe is intended to be used to administer a prohibited drug. So I digress. The point is, good luck trying to make your company whole again after you get a call from Troy Hunt to say that all your records are on Pastebin. They're insuring you for that cost of the cleanup. So what do we do? Well, I think that risk appetite is, everyone has one, and I'm not talking about risk appetite statements. It's a bit like your cholesterol level. So your cholesterol level might be ideal and you can keep on shoving burgers in your face, or it might not be. It might be too low or it might be too high, both of which could mean that you're imminently in trouble. And everybody's different. Some people might have high cholesterol and live to 100 and then die in a naked base jumping accident. But the point is, it's not Schrodinger's cat. Unless you know what it is, you can't begin to make whatever changes you need to make. Which means, how do we measure it? Well, for me, if we go back to this and we talk about that conceptual dotted line, excuse me, that is effectively your appetite for risk manifest. That is the difference between the stuff you do and the stuff you don't. And the higher or lower that line is on in your organization, that is a real strong indicator of what the effective risk appetite is. And any levers that you can use to move that up or down is worthy of consideration. So things that I've seen used is effort. So we sort things by risk, and we go, well, we've only got enough money to do these things, so these are the things we're going to do. Sometimes if you reorder it by the amount of effort it takes to fix it, you can knock off something that's much lower on the list because it's only effectively a day's work. The other thing that someone was talking to me the other day that I found quite interesting was the speed of risk. So resorting these things, rather than just looking them through the lens of risk, is breaking that out into the dimension of how fast things happen, and see if that gives you some more justification for doing some other things or changing things a little bit around. The other thing that I think you could use is the risk matrix. So if you remember this, it's effectively a heat map, right? And what it's there for is to try to get consistency in the way you're treating those things. And you can completely tailor your risk matrix for your organization. It's a kind of one-shot deal. You can't be doing this dynamically. Bearing in mind that risk appetite is something that will change over time and through different phases of your business. So to prove the point that you can tailor a risk matrix, what I did was I put together a high risk, there we go. So high risk appetite, low risk appetite. Risk appetite goes up, risk appetite goes down. Risk appetite goes up, risk appetite goes down. To further prove my point, I invented a risk matrix for the Australian psyche, which kind of is being used in a lot of the top organisations in Australia now, I'm pleased to say. By contrast, there's the British one. I asked my boss what he thought about risk appetite statements, because odds are, if you're thinking about risk appetite, it may be that the business has come to you and said, hey, we need a cyber risk appetite statement. And this is what he said off the top of his head, which I thought was gold, so I've included it here. It's a sort of make-believe way of pretending that you're setting an acceptable threshold for how much risk you're willing to take on. And to prove that point, I went out and I searched for risk appetite statements. So you can Google companies' annual reports that often include these things, and had a look at some of them. And what I found was that mostly they were generally just PR fluff and nonsense. So the company will only tolerate low to moderate gross exposure. Company is not willing to accept risks that compromise our ability to process merchant transactions. The bank has a very low appetite for damage to bank. And when you actually read these and try and work out what they mean, they're just PR statements that say it's the same thing. We have a really low appetite for risk, but that doesn't really mean you have a low appetite for risk. If you get asked to write a risk appetite statement about cyber, you can't say, hey, we're willing to lose 30% of our data. It's just not a good look. So just come up with some nice, sane motherhood statement. That's my finding. So, key takeaways. So, understanding your risk appetite, admitting you've got the problem, is the first step towards modifying your behavior as an organization. Make sure it's in the sweet spot. And it's equally important that it's something that's stable and consistent. Consistent, ongoing consistency is much better than perfection. Don't forget that they're not necessarily static and change over time. It's not what you think it is or what you say it is. It's coded into the DNA of what you do and the people you work with do, and more importantly, what you choose not to do. So you need to go and understand. Don't just parrot what the businesses wants to hear, which is we have a low appetite for risk. Is go and look at the way you're treating the risks you have. Go and look at the things, how they're being addressed, how they're being assessed, how they're being contextualized across the business. And then look for higher order levers to adjust them. So it's not about applying security controls or dropping in a firewall. It's much higher up the stack. It's at that money, politics, religion, layers 8, 9, and 10 that we control that. And that's me. I finished early. Questions?
Goodness, no questions from anybody in the room.
Stunned silence. That's what I'm hoping
I'm stunned
for.
as well. How long did it take you to develop those risk appetite matrices?
Too long.
My question is about, in your one of your slides talked about what to record in the risk register and what you should do something or record.
The treatments.
So my question was, are you saying that even for the ones that you do something, you don't put them in the risk register? Because things change, controls may not be effective. They should still be in the risk register as a record.
Yeah, I'm not saying don't put things in the risk register, but what I'm saying is don't use your risk register as a place to park risks, to sweep them under the carpet. So I've seen. I guess what I see is when you start having things in place that get measured, that over time what happens is you stop measuring the management of those things and start managing the measurement of those things. So I had a customer once where I gave them a risk assessment and they came back to me and said, hey, you've given us a medium risk for this. Can we swap that medium for 2 lows? Because if it's a medium, we have to escalate it, and that's really awkward for us. Can you break it down into smaller components? The other thing I saw happen, which I thought was particularly smart, was raise it as a project risk, and then when the project gets closed down, it goes away. So there's all this kind of horse trading and all these underhand tactics for managing those risks. And what they equate to is an increased risk appetite, because there isn't that consistency. You've got people, sometimes you have people lower down in an organization that are accepting risks that actually are way beyond their pay grade. So you might have someone decide that their project risk is fine, it's their project, they're going to accept it. But when bad things happen, customers who have their data appear on Pastebin don't necessarily understand that it was a project risk rather than a business risk, and they come blame the business. So, yeah, I'm not saying don't put stuff in the risk registers, but don't use risk registers as a way to just do nothing.
So does that mean don't follow the masses and be a sheeple and actually just do what everybody else does? Try and uplift your environment and actually do real security?
Yeah, imagine that.
I'm just wondering, as I'm sitting here, often when I look at my organisation, they have organisational risk appetite, which they haven't really figured out yet. And I'm sitting here thinking, today we've heard you speak on cyber risk appetite. It kind of makes sense to me that we've got risk appetite for our financial office, we've got risk appetite for our whatever widgets we're making, we've got risk appetite for everything we're actually doing. So what are your thoughts on that? Is that a good way to look at things, or...?
Absolutely, but the difficulty is that those parts of the business come to you and say, can you give us a risk appetite statement that fits nicely in line with our risk appetites across the rest of the business? And it's much harder for us to put dollar values on things because we don't have the data, because every organization is different, because everything's subjective, everything's nuanced. So it's almost folly to waste cycles trying to come up with a dollar value when the reality is you could spend months doing it and you could get in a top 4 consulting company to run Monte Carlo, and the output is, in my view, fiction or highly likely to be fictional. So that was what I was trying I'm trying to square that circle. And normally when I do a talk, I come up with a problem or a bit of a rant about something, and I have a bunch of things that here's what I think is the answer, let's have a discussion. And this, when I said this has been an interesting journey, it's because as I got towards the end of my talk, I thought, look, I kind of think I understand this stuff, but I don't know what the truth is, I don't know what I'm advocating here or what the answer is. What I am saying is, don't go and spend a fortune trying to come up with a dollar value if you can have you can have some confidence from the outset that whatever number you come up with is going to be meaningless, if that makes sense. It's an awkward position for me to be in because I'd like to be able to say, hey, here's a really nice way to do it. But it ended up as a joke about the 12 days of Christmas.
It really seems to me like you need to consider, if you come across these situations, recommending implementation of something like SABSA or some of the other architectures that actually consider real risk and actually the needs and requirements of the business based on the business objectives, which will actually pull out all of these other business risks, sub-organisational risks, interoperational necessities between different parts of the business, who's the real risk owner for this component or this component, because risk owners are a really important thing to actually understand. And many businesses think, well, the CISO says I'm the risk owner for that, but in reality, it could be the CFO. It could actually be the CEO, because there's too many people at a slightly lower level that all believe or all have some hand in the ownership of that particular risk.
Yeah, for sure. And if you read about risk appetite, it is that setting an appetite and conveying it through the business and sowing it through the DNA of the organization so that everybody's on board, everyone's in line. And it's not an inherent risk appetite, it's something you've actually prescribed for the business. And risk is a good thing for some businesses. So there is a propensity in cybersecurity to try to eliminate risk completely. And the danger then is it's a drag coefficient on your business because you're pushing it too hard.
That's a business risk in itself, because the risk to eliminate it completely means you're actually putting a great risk on the financial means of the organisation, and the organisation may go under by overspending in this area rather than another area.
Yeah. One of the ideas I had when I was working on this talk was to, as a bit of a gift for all the people who've attended, was to come up with some risks that I could give you about the risks of not having an appropriate risk appetite in cyber, and what the likelihood and the consequence of that would be. But I just ended up feeling it was a little bit unfair to have you all walk away with 3 more risk for your risk register. And it also became a little bit meta and a little bit Inception.
This entire subject space can be very meta and gets unpacked and unravelled. We've still got plenty of time if there's any other questions.
Thanks for your talk. The question is, it's more of it's a question. If you had any thoughts about risk accountability, you sort of touched on risk owners then, and to me that can be really challenging to figure out who actually is the risk owner and who's accountable for this risk, because the nice idea is someone will be accountable for this and then they'll take action on it.
Yep.
But it can be a little bit more challenging in practice.
At the end of the day, accountability lies with the risk owner. And the risk owner may delegate operational components to that risk, but you tell me to do this for you, you're responsible to make sure it actually happened, or at least it meets your requirements. You may engage a third party to audit that, or we might have an SLA whereby if I fail, you can bill me for it, you can sue me for it, but at the end of the day, you're still accountable. It's your business risk, it's your department's operational risk ownership area, even though you might outsource the IT department or some specialist app development group. That's my understanding of that particular scenario.
Yeah, no, well, to me, it's having spent some time researching what happens after a breach. It's who has skin in the game, who's going to get, who's going to end up driving Uber after this all comes out in the press, and how do people behave as a result of that hanging over them, and is that good for your risk appetite or bad?
But the best thing is to actually understand where that belongs before you actually have that breach rather than after.
Yeah, that's the secret. So yeah, the cost of a breach you don't have is a lot cheaper than the ones you do.
Oh dear. Here you go, still.
Right roll.
No, that's fine. Eric, I mean, the risk owner is the one who ends up driving Uber at the end of it, as you say, when they get sacked. But surely all risk is the board's ultimate responsibility, and that guy driving Uber is just the scapegoat. So
Yes.
how do you stop that?
Yes, defensible
Without
position.
gunfire.
Defensible position for the things you choose not to do. The reality is it's difficult to avoid if you're in that position and you're going to be made a scapegoat of. You might want to think about that when you take those types of roles or when you negotiate the package for those types of roles, if it's that type of company, organization. What I saw when I did research into that is that even though there was a propensity for big companies to fire people after the fact, that in itself didn't help the share price. In fact, in many cases, the share price continues to drop after those people are sacrificed, which might mean that as we get more maturity in this space, which is something that's happening organically, you're less likely just to be thrown under the bus when that happens. And we're all on this big maturity journey. The US is way ahead of everyone else because Sarbanes-Oxley has meant that they have lots more CISOs and lots more CISOs. The first generation of CISOs literally were told, come and stand by this altar, put on this robe and don't touch anything. Now we're actually getting people who are empowered to make changes and do things and are now able to understand these things. But I maintain that a lot of the rhetoric in cyber is the board doesn't understand cyber. We need to get people on the board who understand cybersecurity. And I've been saying all along, actually, you need to get people in cyber who understand the board and understand the business because, an analogy I'm fond of is if you imagine a cyber security guy in a hospital running around going, hey, we've got vulnerabilities on the servers, this is really bad. Whereas the risk officer is running around going, hey, we've got asbestos in the children's ward. So which one is going to play out worse in the media? So in the context, actually get on and fix that before you worry about the servers. And that's what's hard for people in cyber sometimes because we are a bit blinkered.
Well, this is translating that risk into what the realised implication is going to be and actually speaking at the board level.
Yep.
I was going to reach back to your point before about CISOs. 9 times out of 10, when there's a massive issue, a massive breach, and the CISO could actually be thrown under the bus as the scapegoat, it's actually worse for the organisation because they're the people with the actual knowledge. They'd learn from this issue, they'd actually then perform better in the organisation, and you might actually find that the issue was actually further upstream, or a lack of management understanding up and down the stream.
Yeah. Remember when after the dot-com bubble burst, people who'd started startups that had failed were a hot commodity because people were mature enough to realise there was a lot to be learned from the people who'd failed. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and maybe that's the next evolution for CISOs is that actually people that have been sacked actually then become instantly employable because they're lessons learned. Who knows?
We'd all rather not fail fast, fail early, but if we do fail fast, fail early, maybe we improve. Oh, well, if we have no further questions, could everybody please thank Eric
Thank you.
for a very thought-provoking talk.